The war in Ukraine is no longer defined solely by trenches, tanks, and territorial maps. It has evolved into something broader, more complex, and more consequential than a traditional battlefield confrontation. Today, it exists in two overlapping but distinct theaters: the grinding war of attrition on the ground and the relentless strategic bombardment campaign unfolding in the air, and increasingly far beyond immediate front lines. The first theater stretches across roughly 1,000 miles of contested terrain. It runs through forests, frozen fields, ruined industrial towns, riverbanks, and heavily fortified defensive belts. This is the visible war, the one marked by artillery duels, infantry assaults, minefields, armored thrusts, and incremental advances measured in meters rather than kilometers. It is a war of exhaustion. Units rotate through shattered positions. Soldiers endure months in trenches under constant shell fire. Villages change hands multiple times only to be reduced to debris. Artillery remains the dominant force, shaping every engagement. Drone reconnaissance hovers above nearly every sector, guiding precision strikes or artillery barrages within minutes of detection. Despite the scale of the fighting, decisive breakthroughs have remained elusive. Neither side possesses the overwhelming superiority required for rapid territorial collapse of the other. Defensive fortifications have grown deeper and more sophisticated. Anti-tank systems and drone-guided munitions have made large armored offensives extraordinarily costly. Minefields stretch for miles. Surveillance is near constant. At the current rate of advance, projections suggest that even a determined offensive would require years, possibly decades, to achieve total territorial victory through ground operations alone. And so the second theater has taken on increasing importance. Every night, as the ground war settles into its rhythm of attrition, a different battle begins overhead. Long-range missiles arc across hundreds of kilometers. Cruise missiles fly low, skimming terrain to evade detection. Swarms of drones, some cheap and expendable, others highly sophisticated, streak toward industrial plants, refineries, power stations, airfields, and rail junctions. This is not merely supporting fire for frontline troops. It is strategic warfare aimed at something deeper: the economic and industrial foundations that make continued fighting possible. The logic behind this aerial campaign is straightforward but ruthless. If one side can impose enough sustained damage on the other's industrial capacity, energy systems, logistics networks, and financial infrastructure, then the cost of continuing the war may eventually exceed the political or economic will to sustain it. In other words, victory may not come from seizing territory, but from breaking endurance. By 2025, this logic had matured into deliberate doctrine. Ukraine, recognizing the stalemate on the ground, began focusing more systematically on what it viewed as the core engines of Russia's war-making ability. Long-range strike capabilities improved, drone production scaled, intelligence operations became more daring. What had begun in earlier years as sporadic deep strikes evolved into a coordinated campaign. Air superiority in the classical sense, total control of skis, remains elusive for both sides, but air disruption has become decisive. The side that can more effectively disrupt the opponent's rear areas gains leverage disproportionate to frontline movements. On the ground, territorial maps shift slowly. In the air, strategic consequences accumulate rapidly. Ukraine's long-range strikes increasingly fell into three primary categories. 1. Military-industrial targets. 2. Logistics infrastructure. 3. Energy systems. Each category represented a different artery feeding Russia's war effort. 1. Military-industrial strikes, targeting the source. Factories producing drones, missiles, microelectronics, armored vehicle components, and communication systems became recurring objectives. These were not symbolic targets. They were functional nodes within a vast supply chain that sustained ongoing operations. When a facility manufacturing cruise missiles is disrupted, the effect is not immediate on the front line, but weeks or months later the inventory shrinks, repair schedules lengthen, substitutions become necessary, production must relocate or harden. The psychological dimension is equally important. When industrial plants deep inside national territory are struck, it erodes the perception of sanctuary. It forces defensive reallocations. Air defenses must be repositioned. Security expenditures increase. Insurance premiums surge. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of this expanded reach came in a coordinated strike on multiple airbases housing strategic bombers. These bombers had been launching long-range cruise missile attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure for years. Through a combination of intelligence preparation and unconventional tactics, drones were deployed against aircraft positioned in the open. Several bombers were reportedly damaged or destroyed. The significance extended beyond material loss. Strategic bombers are not easily replaced. Even limited damage can reduce sortie rates. Moreover, the strike forced reconsideration of deployment patterns. Aircraft dispersal increases logistical complexity and maintenance strain. Distance, once considered protective, was shown to be vulnerable. Airbases across multiple regions were subsequently struck throughout the year. Even when physical destruction was limited, the cumulative disruption affected operational tempo. 2. Logistics, the arteries of war. Modern warfare runs on logistics. Ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and personnel must move constantly. Railways are particularly vital in a country of continental scale. Repeated strikes on rail lines, junctions, and fuel trains disrupted flows. Even temporary derailments require rerouting and inspection. Each disruption introduces friction. Fuel trains were especially significant targets. Armored units and mechanized brigades depend on constant fuel supply. Disrupting fuel logistics can constrain operational flexibility, even without direct battlefield engagement. Rail substations and relay cabinets were also struck, creating cascading shutdowns along entire corridors. Ports serving both military and commercial purposes faced similar pressure. Oil storage tanks ignited. Export facilities paused operations. Even short interruptions ripple into global markets, raising risk assessments and insurance rates. 3. Energy infrastructure, the financial core. Perhaps the most strategically ambitious element of the campaign targeted oil refineries, storage depots, and gas facilities. Energy exports remain a cornerstone of Russian state revenue. While the economy has diversified over the years, oil and gas income continues to provide substantial fiscal resources. Strikes on refineries not only damage physical capacity but also disrupt distribution networks. Repairs are costly and time-consuming. Production slowdowns reduce export volumes. Insurance claims increase. Maritime operations extended this pressure outward. Oil tankers associated with sanctioned export networks suffered explosions and severe damage in multiple incidents. Whether through naval drones or other methods, the pattern suggested a deliberate attempt to increase the cost and risk of transporting Russian crude. Replacing a damaged tanker can cost tens of millions of dollars. Losing a fully loaded cargo can exceed $200 million in value. Insurance premiums for vessels operating in affected waters reportedly surged dramatically. Some shipping operators withdrew from Russian cargo altogether, citing untenable risks. The broader strategic idea behind these operations has been described as kinetic sanctions, using physical strikes to achieve economic effects beyond traditional financial sanctions. If revenue shrinks while military expenditures surge, fiscal strain intensifies. Official defense spending has risen sharply. Broader security expenditures are even higher when classified categories are included. Oil revenues, while substantial, no longer fully cover war costs. Estimates suggest that drone and missile strikes inflicted billions of dollars in direct and indirect losses on Russia's oil sector in a single year. Refining throughput declined modestly. Insurance payouts under sabotage categories surged. Loss ratios for certain portfolios reportedly multiplied. From a purely economic lens, pressure was mounting. The other side of the sky, yet the air war is not unilateral. Russia's retaliatory campaign has been vast. Thousands of missiles and tens of thousands of drones were launched toward Ukrainian territory in 2025 alone. Even assuming interception rates above 90%, hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones reached targets. Ukraine's energy grid became the central focus. Thermal power plants suffered extensive damage. Hydropower facilities were degraded. Generating capacity dropped dramatically compared to pre-invasion levels. In winter conditions where temperatures routinely plunge below freezing, infrastructure destruction translates directly into humanitarian crisis. Electricity outages limit heating, water pumping, sewage systems, and industrial output. Emergency power schedules restrict households to only a few hours of electricity per day. Businesses struggle. Hospitals depend on generators. Urban infrastructure deteriorates under strain. Burst pipes freeze and rupture. Residents improvise sanitation solutions. Public frustration grows. The asymmetry is stark. Russia's geographic size and dispersed infrastructure make comprehensive disruption more difficult. Ukraine's smaller, more concentrated grid absorbs proportionally greater impact. Thus emerges the central strategic tension. Ukraine's strikes impose measurable economic costs on Russia's war machine. Russia's strikes impose immediate humanitarian and infrastructural hardship on Ukraine, which pressure proves more decisive. That question defines the unfolding trajectory of the conflict. The Russia-Ukraine war has become the first large-scale industrial conflict where unmanned systems are not supplementary tools but central actors. The sky is no longer dominated exclusively by fighter jets and bombers. Instead, it hums with quadcopters, loitering munitions, naval drones, long-range strike UAVs, and improvised platforms assembled in warehouses and garages. The democratization of air power has fundamentally changed the balance of cost. The cost curve has flipped. Traditional air warfare is expensive. Fighter jets cost tens of millions of dollars. Cruise missiles can cost several million each. Air defense interceptors are often priced in the hundreds of thousands to millions per unit. Drones change the equation. Many strike drones used in the conflict cost a fraction of the systems used to shoot them down. Some improvised long-range drones are assembled for tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes less. Even more advanced domestically produced systems remain dramatically cheaper than cruise missiles. This creates a cost imbalance. If a $30,000 drone forces the launch of a $500,000 interceptor missile, the defender wins tactically, but loses economically over time. Multiply that imbalance by hundreds or thousands of engagements, and the strategic implications grow enormous. Ukraine leaned heavily into this asymmetry. Rather than trying to match Russia missile for missile, it expanded drone production. Civilian tech companies pivoted to military manufacturing. Software developers designed autonomous navigation systems. Volunteers assembled components. 3D printing filled supply gaps. University labs became research hubs. A decentralized production model emerged, harder to target, more flexible, faster to adapt. Russia, too, accelerated domestic drone production while importing components and, in some cases, entire systems from external partners. Over time, both sides evolved from using off-the-shelf commercial drones to fielding increasingly specialized military designs. The battlefield became a laboratory, from tactical to strategic drones. At the beginning of the war, drones were primarily tactical: reconnaissance over trenches, artillery spotting, short-range explosive drops. By 2025, that had shifted dramatically. Long-range strike drones capable of flying hundreds, even over 1,000 kilometers, became a defining feature of the conflict. They targeted refineries, aircraft, ammunition depots, naval vessels, and power plants far behind the lines. These drones did not need to be perfect. They only needed to be persistent. If even a small percentage penetrated defenses, the psychological and economic effect could be significant. The goal was not necessarily annihilation, but disruption. And disruption compounds. A refinery that pauses for inspection loses production hours. A facility that catches fire loses weeks. A factory forced to increase security loses efficiency. Each interruption adds friction to an already strained system. Strategic bombing in the 20th century relied on massive formations of aircraft. In the 21st century, it may rely on swarms of relatively inexpensive autonomous systems. Insurance, risk, and the invisible battlefield. One of the least visible but most consequential dimensions of this war lies in insurance markets. When oil tankers operating in risky waters begin experiencing explosions or drone incidents, insurers reassess risk. War risk premiums rise, underwriters adjust exposure. Some routes become commercially unattractive. Even rumors can move markets. If insurers categorize incidents under sabotage or hostile action, payouts increase dramatically. Over time, insurers may demand higher premiums or restrict coverage entirely. This matters because energy exports depend not only on production but on transport and financing. Shipping companies, insurers, banks, and logistics firms form a web of interdependence. Ukraine's deep strikes, particularly those targeting energy infrastructure and maritime assets, appeared designed to create precisely this type of cascading economic friction. The strategy raised the cost of doing business. Russia's counterpressure, infrastructure as leverage. Russia's air campaign against Ukraine's energy infrastructure operates under a different logic. Where Ukraine's strikes aim at revenue and industrial output, Russia's aim appears centered on public endurance. Destroying thermal plants, damaging substations, and targeting grid nodes reduces electricity supply. Blackouts force rationing. Industry slows, households suffer. Winter amplifies everything. Temperatures in Ukrainian cities regularly fall below freezing. When heating systems fail, the humanitarian impact is immediate. Pipes freeze, water systems falter, emergency shelters fill. The cumulative effect is not only economic, it is psychological. If civilians grow exhausted by infrastructure collapse, political pressure may rise, international donors may face fatigue, reconstruction costs balloon. The grid becomes a battlefield. Production capacity versus human endurance. By late 2025, analysts began framing the conflict less as a contest of territory and more as a contest of endurance capacity. Which society can absorb more disruption? Russia's advantages include geographic scale, natural resource wealth, and a centralized political structure capable of sustaining high military spending without immediate electoral consequences. Ukraine's advantages include technological agility, Western financial backing, and a population that has demonstrated extraordinary mobilization capacity. But both sides face strain. Russia's defense spending surged to levels not seen in decades. Broader security expenditures rose further when classified allocations were included. Civilian sectors felt labor shortages as mobilization and defense industry hearing pulled workers from other industries. Ukraine's economy contracted severely in the early phases of the war, later stabilizing with Western aid. Yet energy destruction continues to limit industrial recovery. Reconstruction needs are enormous and growing. Endurance has a financial dimension and a social dimension. Money can buy weapons, but morale sustains will. Drone swarms and the saturation problem. Air defense systems are highly effective, but they are finite. Each system has reload times, radar coverage limits, and interceptor inventories. Swarm tactics exploit this reality. Launch enough drones simultaneously from multiple directions, and defenses must prioritize. Even if interception rates remain high, saturation increases the probability that some projectiles penetrate. This dynamic has shaped strike patterns. Coordinated waves combining drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles attempt to overwhelm layered defenses. It is a chess match measured in radar signatures and launch timing. The strategic question. At its core, the evolving air war raises a fundamental question. Can economic attrition achieve what territorial offensives have not? If Ukraine can inflict sustained economic costs exceeding the revenue sustaining Russia's war budget, it hopes to tilt the balance. If Russia can inflict sustained infrastructural degradation that strains Ukrainian society and exhausts Western support, it hopes to tilt the balance. Both strategies are long games. Neither produces immediate headlines of dramatic frontline collapse. Instead, they produce incremental shifts, reduced refining capacity here, extended blackouts there, rising insurance costs elsewhere. Victory, if it comes through this pathway, will not resemble a dramatic battlefield breakthrough. It will resemble cumulative exhaustion. A war that is teaching the world. Beyond the immediate participants, militaries worldwide are studying this conflict carefully. The war is redefining the role of drones in industrial warfare, the economics of missile defense, the vulnerability of energy infrastructure, the feasibility of long-range precision strikes by mid-sized powers, the relationship between sanctions and kinetic disruption. Future conflicts will likely incorporate lessons learned here. Airfields will be hardened differently. Refineries will reconsider dispersal. Insurance frameworks may permanently change risk calculations in contested regions. The war is reshaping doctrine in real time. Where it leads, as both sides expand drone production and refine targeting doctrine, escalation risks grow. Strikes deeper into territory blur lines once considered stabilizing. The farther weapons travel, the greater the geopolitical sensitivity. All the while, the ground war continues, grinding, relentless, costly. Two wars in one measured in meters of mud. The other measured in kilowatts, barrels, premiums, and balance sheets. And the longer both continue, the more endurance, not maneuver, becomes the decisive variable. Manpower, mobilization, and the generational cost. If drones define the sky and missiles shape infrastructure, manpower still determines whether territory is held or lost. Despite the rapid technological evolution of the war, it remains at its core a human conflict. Trenches must be occupied, positions must be defended, artillery must be loaded, vehicles must be repaired, logistics must be driven forward. Even in a drone-saturated battlefield, soldiers remain the decisive factor in controlling ground. And by 2026, manpower has become one of the most consequential and sensitive dimensions of the war. The arithmetic of attrition, casualty estimates are fiercely disputed and tightly controlled by both governments, but independent assessments suggest combined killed, wounded, and missing on both sides have reached staggering levels, approaching numbers not seen in Europe since World War II. Attritional warfare follows brutal mathematics. When artillery dominates, casualty rates rise. When front lines stretch for hundreds of miles, troop requirements expand. When offensives stall, repeated assaults compound losses. Even small territorial gains can require immense human cost. For Russia, early expectations of a rapid campaign gave way to prolonged mobilization. Initial contract forces were supplemented by partial mobilization waves. Volunteer battalions were formed regionally. Recruitment incentives increased, including substantial signing bonuses and salary packages. Financial inducement became a primary tool. In economically struggling regions, military contracts offered income far above local averages. For many recruits, the decision was driven less by ideology than by economic necessity. Over time, another controversial recruitment pool expanded: prisoners. Convicts were offered reduced sentences or pardons in exchange for service at the front. This policy provided immediate manpower but raised long-term social and military discipline concerns. Casualty rates among such units were reportedly high, particularly in the most dangerous assault roles. Russia also expanded recruitment beyond its core demographic centers, drawing from rural regions and minority populations at disproportionate rates. This uneven distribution has raised demographic questions about long-term regional impact. Ukraine's mobilization challenge. Ukraine faced a different set of constraints. With a smaller population base, sustaining prolonged high-intensity warfare places significant strain on demographics. Early waves of patriotic volunteers gradually gave way to more structured mobilization systems. Debates over draft age adjustments and service exemptions became politically sensitive topics. Urban professionals, students, and skilled workers increasingly faced mobilization pressures as the war extended into its third and fourth years. Balancing frontline needs with economic sustainability became a central dilemma. Pull too many skilled workers into uniform, and the economy weakens further. Leave too many in civilian roles, and the front lines risk thinning. The psychological burden is immense. Nearly every family is directly or indirectly connected to someone serving. Casualty notifications ripple through communities. Social media amplifies grief in real time. Unlike earlier wars, this conflict unfolds under constant digital documentation. Drone footage, helmet camera recordings, and battlefield videos circulate widely. The brutality is visible. The generational gap, perhaps the most profound long-term consequence, lies in generational demographics. Young men and increasingly women, in their 20s and 30s, represent not only the bulk of combat forces, but also the backbone of future economic growth and family formation. Prolonged conflict alters population pyramids. High casualty rates combined with displacement and emigration reduce birth rates. Ukraine has experienced significant refugee outflows, particularly among women and children. Some have returned, many remain abroad. Russia has faced emigration waves as well, particularly among younger, educated men seeking to avoid mobilization or economic uncertainty. Demographic scars may outlast the war itself. Even if hostilities ended tomorrow, the absence of tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands, from a generation reshapes labor markets, family structures, and long-term economic productivity. Wars are often remembered for territorial shifts. Their deeper impact often lies in demographic shifts. Morale under prolonged strain. Sustaining morale in a prolonged attritional war is extraordinarily difficult. In the early stages, unity is often strong. Over time, fatigue sets in. For Russia, state-controlled media has maintained a consistent narrative emphasizing defense against Western encroachment. Public dissent exists but remains constrained. economic adaptation to sanctions has softened immediate shock effects. However, rising military expenditures crowd out civilian priorities. Inflation and labor shortages create underlying pressures. Casualty secrecy helps maintain stability, but it also creates information vacuums. For Ukraine, the narrative remains one of national survival. International support reinforces morale, yet repeated infrastructure destruction, blackouts, and casualty lists weigh heavily. Each winter tests resilience anew, and yet resilience has so far proven remarkable. Foreign fighters and external influence. Another dimension of manpower involves foreign participants. Ukraine has received volunteers from various countries, some motivated by ideology, others by solidarity. These units remain limited in scale but symbolically significant. Russia, meanwhile, has reportedly expanded recruitment networks beyond its borders as well, offering contracts to individuals from economically vulnerable regions in other countries. The presence of foreign fighters adds geopolitical complexity. It internationalizes perception of the conflict even when official state participation remains indirect. Training and experience. A prolonged war produces a different kind of military force, experienced. Units that survive multiple rotations develop tactical sophistication. Drone operators refine targeting techniques. Artillery crews improve coordination. Command structures adapt. But experience comes at cost. High casualty turnover means constant training cycles. New recruits must integrate quickly into combat environments. Leadership gaps emerge when experienced officers are lost. Both sides have cycled through multiple waves of newly trained personnel, attempting to balance fresh manpower with battlefield competence. The silent calculation. Behind closed doors, planners on both sides confront a stark question. How many more can we sustain, not just in raw numbers but in societal tolerance? Wars of attrition test not only armies but social contracts. Governments must convince populations that sacrifice remains justified. If belief erodes, manpower falters. If manpower falters, territory becomes harder to hold. The long shadow, the Russia-Ukraine war, may ultimately be studied not only for its drone innovations or missile campaigns, but for its demographic consequences. A generation shaped by trenches and blackouts, children growing up with air raid sirens as background noise. Families split across borders, communities marked by memorials. Even if reconstruction eventually transforms shattered cities into modern skylines, the absence of those lost cannot be rebuilt. This is the cost beyond strategy, the cost measured not in kilometers but in years of life. By its fourth year, the Russia-Ukraine war is no longer confined to the trenches of eastern Ukraine or the airspace above contested territory. Its effects ripple outward across Europe into global energy markets, through food supply chains, and into the strategic calculations of major powers. What began as a regional invasion has evolved into a systemic geopolitical stress test. NATO's strategic reawakening. Perhaps the most immediate geopolitical consequence has been the transformation of NATO. Before 2022, the alliance was often described as politically divided and strategically uncertain. Defense spending commitments were inconsistently met. Long-term planning sometimes drifted toward crisis management rather than large-scale war preparation. The invasion changed that trajectory almost overnight. Defense budgets surged across Europe, forward deployments increased, multinational battle groups expanded along NATO's eastern flank, air defense systems were repositioned, ammunition production lines reopened or scaled up after decades of peacetime downsizing. The alliance moved from reassurance posture to deterrence posture. Countries geographically closest to Russia accelerated military modernization programs. Stockpiles once considered adequate were reassessed as insufficient after observing the ammunition consumption rates inside Ukraine. Industrial capacity, especially artillery shell production, became a top priority. The war revealed something uncomfortable. Modern high-intensity conflict consumes material at staggering speed. The industrial base awakens. For decades, many Western defense industries operated under just-in-time production logic optimized for smaller conflicts. Ukraine's artillery usage alone often exceeded peacetime annual production levels in several NATO countries combined. This forced a rapid industrial recalibration. Factories expanded shifts. Governments signed long-term procurement contracts to justify capital investment. Supply chains were re-examined for vulnerabilities, particularly reliance on rare earth elements or microelectronics from geopolitically sensitive regions. War reshaped industrial policy. Defense manufacturing regained strategic centrality. The phrase arsenal of democracy, once historical, re-entered policy discussions. Energy markets, shock and adaptation. Energy was one of the earliest global shockwaves. Russia's role as a major exporter of oil and natural gas meant sanctions, pipeline disruptions, and maritime risk had immediate price implications. European countries that once relied heavily on Russian gas were forced into rapid diversification. Liquefied natural gas imports surged. New terminals were constructed. Long-term supply contracts were renegotiated. Energy security reemerged as a core national security issue rather than merely an economic concern. Price spikes in the early years of the war fueled inflation worldwide. Over time, markets adapted. Alternative suppliers increased output, shipping routes diversified, price volatility eased compared to initial shock phases. But the lesson endured: energy dependence is strategic vulnerability. Food security and the Black Sea. Beyond energy, food supply chains were heavily affected. Ukraine and Russia are both major exporters of grain and agricultural commodities. Disruptions in Black Sea shipping created global concern, particularly for countries in Africa and the Middle East reliant on imported wheat. Blockades, port damage, and maritime risk insurance hikes threatened shipments. Temporary export agreements reduced pressure at times, but uncertainty remained constant. Food prices climbed sharply during peak disruption phases, exacerbating political instability in already fragile regions. The war demonstrated how localized military conflict can trigger global food insecurity. Sanctions versus kinetic pressure. The conflict has also become a test case in economic warfare. Western sanctions targeted banking systems, export controls, energy revenue streams, and high-tech imports. The objective: constrain Russia's ability to finance and technologically sustain its war effort. Sanctions achieved partial effects. Access to certain technologies narrowed. Financial reserves were frozen. Energy price caps were implemented. Yet Russia adapted. Trade rerouted toward alternative markets. Domestic production substituted for some imports. Parallel import networks emerged. Currency controls stabilized financial panic in early phases. This adaptation led Ukraine to complement sanctions with what some analysts describe as kinetic economic pressure, physically striking refineries, fuel depots, and logistical nodes to create real-world economic friction beyond financial restrictions. Thus, two economic battlefields emerged. 1. Sanctions imposed externally. 2. Infrastructure disruption imposed physically. The effectiveness of each remains debated, but together they represent one of the most extensive economic warfare campaigns in modern history. Escalation management. Despite intense fighting, direct confrontation between NATO and Russia has been carefully avoided. Military aid flows into Ukraine. Intelligence sharing continues. Training missions operate outside Ukrainian territory, yet formal alliance troops have not entered combat directly. Both sides appear to recognize escalation thresholds. However, the margin for error narrows as long-range strikes extend deeper into territory and as new weapon systems are introduced. Each technological upgrade, longer-range missiles, more advanced air defenses, more autonomous drone swarms, introduces fresh escalation calculations. Strategic ambiguity becomes both shield and risk. China's calculated distance. While not directly involved militarily, China's posture carries enormous weight. Beijing has maintained a formally neutral stance while deepening economic ties with Moscow. Energy purchases increased, trade volumes expanded. At the same time, China has avoided overt military alliance commitments that would trigger secondary sanctions or broader confrontation. The war serves as a strategic observation window for Beijing, offering insights into Western sanctions mechanisms, NATO cohesion, and drone warfare effectiveness. Global power competition quietly threads through the conflict's background. The global South and alignment fluidity. Outside Western alliances, reactions have been more mixed. Many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America view the conflict through lenses shaped by colonial history, non-alignment traditions, or economic pragmatism. Some abstained from UN resolutions. Others balanced diplomatic language carefully. Energy and grain access often shaped policy more than ideological alignment. The war has highlighted a shifting global order where alignment is less binary than during the Cold War era. The nuclear shadow, looming above all conventional dynamics, is the nuclear factor. Russia possesses one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals. NATO includes multiple nuclear powers. Throughout the conflict, rhetorical signaling around nuclear deterrence has surfaced periodically. While no nuclear use has occurred, the mere presence of such capabilities shapes strategic restraint. Red lines remain deliberately opaque. The world watches carefully whenever escalation rhetoric intensifies. The long war and strategic patience. Perhaps the defining geopolitical feature of this phase is duration. Short wars test readiness, long wars test patience. Western governments must maintain domestic political support for aid packages. Russia must maintain internal stability amid prolonged mobilization and economic strain. Ukraine must sustain morale despite infrastructure devastation. Each election cycle in democratic countries introduces uncertainty about future policy continuity. Time becomes a strategic actor. A rewritten security architecture. Regardless of eventual battlefield outcomes, Europe's security architecture has already changed. Defense budgets are higher, military planning is more urgent, energy diversification is entrenched policy, industrial mobilization capacity is under review. Trust between Russia and Western Europe, once based on economic interdependence, has eroded dramatically. The pre-2022 equilibrium is unlikely to return. The central question moving forward, as the war grinds onward, the global implications hinge on one overarching question. Will exhaustion force negotiation, or will escalation redefine the conflict entirely? The answer depends not only on battlefield developments, but on economic resilience, political stability, alliance cohesion, and global power calculations. The Russia-Ukraine war is no longer just a regional conflict. It is a stress test for the international system itself. ENDGMES collapse or frozen future. After years of attrition, drone warfare, economic pressure, and global shockwaves, the central question looms larger than ever. How does this end? History suggests that wars rarely conclude exactly as envisioned at their outset. They end through exhaustion, breakthrough, negotiation, collapse, or some uneasy hybrid of all four. The Russia-Ukraine war now sits in a phase where multiple potential endgames coexist, none inevitable, none simple. Scenario 1: gradual exhaustion and negotiated settlement. The most discussed and most complex pathway is negotiated settlement born from exhaustion. In this scenario, neither side achieves decisive military victory. Territorial lines stabilize through attritional stalemate. Economic pressure compounds. Casualties continue, but without major shifts. International mediators quietly explore frameworks for ceasefire. But negotiation faces enormous barriers: territorial sovereignty disputes, security guarantees for Ukraine, sanctions relief mechanisms, accountability for wartime destruction, domestic political legitimacy. For Ukraine, any formal recognition of territorial loss presents profound constitutional and moral challenges. For Russia, retreating without tangible gains risks internal political repercussions. Thus, negotiations would likely require creative frameworks: phased ceasefires, demilitarized zones monitored internationally, conditional sanctions relief, or long-term security guarantees structured outside formal NATO membership. Even then, trust would be minimal. A ceasefire might resemble armistice rather than peace, halting large-scale combat but leaving political disputes unresolved. Scenario 2: frozen conflict. Another possibility is de facto freezing without formal settlement. Front lines harden, artillery exchanges diminish but never fully cease, long-range strikes reduce in frequency, diplomatic talks stall without collapse, sanctions remain in place, occasional flare-ups punctuate relative quiet. The region becomes militarized indefinitely. This model resembles other post-Soviet territorial conflicts, unresolved, tense, but not actively escalating daily. The danger in a frozen conflict is long-term instability. rearmament cycles, constant deterrence pressure, and periodic escalatory crises. For Ukraine, a frozen war complicates reconstruction and investment. For Russia, it preserves leverage but prolongs isolation. It is stability without resolution. Scenario 3: Escalation and expanded war. Though neither side appears to seek direct confrontation with NATO, escalation risks remain. Triggers could include strikes perceived as crossing strategic red lines, miscalculation involving long range missile systems, direct involvement of external forces, and severe political instability inside one participant state. Escalation does not necessarily mean nuclear use, though the nuclear shadow always shapes calculations. It could involve expanded conventional targeting, cyber escalation, or broader regional destabilization. This scenario carries the highest global risk and remains the least predictable. Scenario 4: Internal political shifts. Wars sometimes end not from battlefield events but from political transformation. A major leadership change in either country could reset negotiation dynamics. Economic strain, public unrest, or elite fractures might alter strategic calculations. However, predicting internal political change is extraordinarily difficult. States at war often consolidate rather than fragment, at least in the short term. Still, prolonged attrition increases uncertainty. Ukraine's post-war horizon. If large-scale hostilities eventually subside, Ukraine faces a reconstruction challenge unprecedented in modern Europe. Entire cities require rebuilding, energy grids need modernization, housing stock must be restored, demining operations could take decades. Yet reconstruction also presents opportunity. With sufficient investment and integration into European markets, Ukraine could modernize infrastructure beyond pre-war standards. Renewable energy expansion, digital governance reforms, and defense industry growth may reshape the economy. Security guarantees will define its long-term stability. Whether through NATO integration, bilateral defense treaties, or new multilateral structures, deterrence credibility will determine whether war truly ends or merely pauses. A post-war Ukraine would likely remain heavily militarized for years, shaped permanently by its experience. Russia's strategic crossroads. For Russia, the endgame also reshapes its trajectory. Prolonged war spending has reoriented its economy toward defense production. Energy export patterns have shifted geographically. Relations with Western Europe have deteriorated dramatically. Post-war Russia faces choices: continue eastward economic pivot, seek gradual normalization with Europe, maintain hardened strategic posture, restructure domestic economic priorities. Sanctions relief, if it occurs, would likely be incremental and conditional. The demographic and fiscal costs of sustained war will linger regardless of territorial outcome. The psychological aftermath: even when fighting stops, psychological scars persist. Veterans return with trauma, displaced families resettle or choose not to return at all, memorials mark neighborhoods, political narratives harden. Reconciliation between societies becomes extraordinarily difficult after prolonged violence and mutual accusation. Generations will grow up shaped by this conflict's memory. The global system after the war. Beyond the region itself, the war has already reshaped global dynamics. NATO defense spending is structurally higher, energy diversification is entrenched, drone warfare doctrine has permanently evolved, economic sanctions as strategic tools have been stress-tested, insurance and shipping industries recalibrated geopolitical risk models. Even if peace arrives, the world does not revert to 2021. The conflict has accelerated the fragmentation of the international order into competing blocs with overlapping economic ties but hardened security boundaries. The long war theory. Some analysts argue that the war's end will not come through dramatic treaty signing, but through slow diminishing intensity. Fewer missile barrages, fewer offensives, more localized engagements. Eventually, a ceasefire emerges not from grand negotiation, but from mutual depletion. History offers precedent: wars that simply burn out, but burnout can take years. The human variable. Ultimately, endgames are shaped not only by strategy, but by people. Leaders calculate risk, soldiers endure orders, civilians weigh hardship against hope, allies assess political cost, markets respond to uncertainty. The war has become a test of endurance at every level: industrial, financial, military, political, demographic, and psychological. Whichever side maintains cohesion longer holds advantage. A conflict that redefined modern war. Looking across all 5 parts of this series, a clear pattern emerges. This war is not defined by one dimension alone. It is a trench war reminiscent of the 20th century, a drone war emblematic of the 21st century, an economic war fought through sanctions and infrastructure strikes, a demographic war reshaping generations, and a geopolitical war restructuring alliances. Its end will likely be equally multidimensional. The unanswered questions: will exhaustion lead to compromise? Will technological escalation shift momentum? Will internal politics alter strategy, or will the conflict settle into a prolonged armed standoff that defines European security for decades? No single variable decides it, but one reality is certain. Whatever the eventual outcome, the Russia-Ukraine war has already altered the trajectory of Europe, reshaped military doctrine worldwide, and left a generational imprint that will endure long after the final shot is fired. Subscribe to Military Radio to stay informed as this situation continues to develop, and make sure you don't miss any important updates. Thank you for watching and for your continued support.